Okay, we are 2 minutes early. Imagine that. So, first of all, I want to introduce the co-moderator of our keynote speaker session. She's Kristen Haley. I'm so happy you are here. It's a pleasure to work with you today. Kristen Haley is from Washington State Liquor and Cannabis Board, and she has an impressive career in prevention and health communication, which you can read in her bio that is presented both online and it's available to you to read. Kristen currently serves as a public health education liaison at Washington State Liquor Cannabis Board, and her work centers around audience and partner engagement, seeking upstream prevention strategies wherever possible. She believes that collaboration is critical to ensuring safe and healthy communities. We believe that too. We are lucky to have you today. Kristen will facilitate the Q&A part of the keynote speaking. I'm going to introduce Dr. Marta Forti, and we get started. It's also an honor and a pleasure to have Dr. Marta Forti presenting to us today. She's our keynote speaker of this whole event. Dr. Marta Forti is a clinical reader in psychosis research at the Department of Social Development and Genetics in the King's College of London. She leads the first cannabis clinic for patients with psychotic disorders in UK, starting in 2020. Dr. Forti was granted our MRC Senior Research Fellowship to expand her research in the role of cannabis in psychosis and its underlying biology. Her research employs technologies such as virtual reality and genetic data, DNA methylation data, and peripheral levels of endocannabinoids from human participants, and also animal models experiment of pubertal exposure to cannabinoids to investigate biological markers of susceptibility to psychosis among heavy cannabis users. It's an honor to have you here, Dr. Forti, and we are so thankful you can present all the way from Italy to us today, from London, actually, to us today. Thank you.
The pleasure is absolutely mine, and I hope you can hear me okay. And I'm sorry if I have this sort of rocky voice, but I'm just recovering from a little laryngitis. So I'm the one honored to be with you today because the topic that I'm going to share with you is something that is very dear to me, both as a clinician, because I'm a psychiatrist, so I'm a clinician, but also as an academic. My research is entirely centered on the relationship between cannabis use and psychotic disorder. You can see that behind me there is my cat that has decided to join, and that's because in UK you can also buy treats for pets with cannabis. So I think he has decided to listen today in as well. So I will share with you. So Beatriz, when she introduced me, she mentioned that currently my research team is looking at virtual reality, is looking at genetic, epigenetic, and also some animal model research. This is part of my ongoing project. So some of these data are not yet available to be shared, but I will take you on a journey of what has been the past and the present of the work that I've been contributing to together with the extraordinary sort of world community of researchers, including at the head of it, Professor Cyril de Souza, who will follow from me, and of course, Professor Sir Robin Murray from KCL as well. So when I tend to talk to people, I don't want to assume that everybody agrees that there is a causal link between cannabis use and psychotic disorder. So I want to start reminding all of us that there have been to date 3 meta-analyses which summarize all the existing epidemiological literature that has explored this link, and they've all converged, which is very unusual, I should say, in the epidemiology of psychotic disorder, in concluding that when you look at people who have used cannabis at some point in their lifetime, what we will call lifetime yes or no cannabis use, they would all have a doubling in the risk of developing later on psychotic disorder. And the reason I say later on is because most people would start using cannabis in their early teens, when we do see the onset of psychotic disorder in the late teens, early 20s. But also, the latest meta analysis went a step ahead and did something that, in some way, if you think about it, is really common sense rather than sort of sophisticated science. They decided, rather than looking at the relationship between asking people, have you ever used cannabis, yes or no, in your lifetime, they decided to ask or to use measure of amount of consumption. And I think this is very important, because if you think about any other substance of abuse, for instance, think about alcohol. If I were with you in the room, I will do something that I usually do in lecture. I would ask you to put your hand up if you have ever used alcohol in your lifetime. Now, I don't know what the makeup of the audience is, but I would assume that most of you would have tried alcohol at least once in their lifetime. But this will tell me nothing about your risk to develop liver disease, for instance. But it's interesting that pretty much all the early stages of the literature on cannabis and psychosis, they were all based on just asking people, have you used cannabis, yes or no? So in this last meta-analysis, Dr. Vangelis Vassos, that you can see lying down in this beautiful picture, was able to use data from at least the studies who had some measure of amount of consumption, either frequency or actually amount in grams. And he created a continuous measure that you can see here on the horizontal x-axis of exposure to cannabis. And you can see that greater is the exposure to cannabis. For each of these lines that represent one of the study parts of this meta-analysis, there is an increase in the odds ratio, so in the probability of developing a psychotic disorder. And the overall estimate from this meta-analysis is not any longer just a doubling of the risk, but is a 4 times increase in the risk. And you'll be amused to know that actually the red line, which is the one that is leading the way in having the highest odds ratio for psychotic disorder, represents a study I was involved in, but more importantly, the catchment area in London where I work as a psychiatrist. So the issue of cannabis and psychosis for me has always been very relevant. And one of the reasons we were leading the way in this meta-analysis is because the catchment area where the participant came from, both the cases and the control, had predominantly access to quite highly concentrated in THC type of cannabis. And I'll tell you more about this in a minute. And this is actually a cartoon that we created with some of the people under my care, which they see represents their experience when they are psychotic under the effect of cannabis. And it is predominantly an onset of psychosis which affects the thinking process. Sometimes they also complain of auditory hallucinations, so hearing voices that nobody else can hear, but predominantly is a subtle and pervasive change of the way they understand the reality around them. So the world begins to be threatening and hostile. They go around the street and they feel people are watching them in a threatening and hostile way. They might go to a IT shop and the television feel like they're reporting about their life. And when they sort of feel that withdraw more and more into their own flat because they're not safe outside, they realize that the television is once again referring to their life and can actually intrude and insert thoughts in their mind. And they begin to wonder if the neighbors have planted microchip under their floorboards and they feel that the brain is on fire. You can imagine how these experiences are extraordinarily intrusive, but also disabling, because they really cut the individual out of relationship and the outside world. And this is not just something that you can depict in a cartoon, but actually has been shown in studies where people who have developed a psychotic disorder in the context of cannabis use, they've been compared for their symptoms profile to people who have developed psychosis through other pathway. I mean, psychosis by all means is the multifactorial disorder. So cannabis can be a significant and the main risk factor for a group, but it's never going to be the only risk factor for somebody. So when this comparison was done, it was clear that people who had been using daily high potency type of cannabis or type of cannabis with a high concentration of THC were much more likely at the onset to present positive symptoms. And what we mean with this in psychiatry are exactly the experiences I shared with you. So feeling threatened and believing that people are against you and that you are persecuted, and this belief develop the nature of a delusion, which is a belief held against the evidence of the contrary, and most of the time not shared by people from the same background, but also experiences like hallucinations, so hearing voices that nobody else can hear, or sometimes also seeing things that other people can see, although this is less common in cannabis-associated psychosis. And in the context of the development of this literature, I was always very keen at addressing two important clinical questions, because these were the question that the young adult I see in my clinic would actually ask me, because very relevant to them. You know, they would come to me and say, okay, well, you saying that perhaps cannabis has played a role in my psychosis, but why my friends who are also using cannabis, they have not developed the same condition and they're going by almost fine with their life. And so the point is that by all means, not all cannabis users will develop a psychotic disorder, but who are the ones that do, because developing a psychotic disorder can have a profound impact on the life trajectory of a young person. So I thought to start from a quite basic question, which again was borrowed pretty much by the effects of other substances on health. And it was, well, could it be that it is something to do with the way people consume cannabis? And here is Shakespeare smoking a very big joint. And so the first question is, as we said already, could it be that the amount plays a role? Or could it be also that the quality of actually what's inside the joint or the bong or whatever is the mode of consumption, or the mode of consumption itself can have an impact on how likely it's somebody to develop psychotic disorder, and also perhaps the age of when they start using cannabis. And other colleagues had begun already to explore that question at the same time. But the other question came really from the interaction in the academic community. Normally, if an environmental exposure, so a habit or a lifestyle, is a risk factor for a disease, where you see lots of the habits or the lifestyle, you should see an increase in the number of new cases of the disease. To give you an example that is familiar to all of us, we know that obesity is a risk factor for diabetes type 2. So in those populations across the world, or at times in history where there have been lots of obesity, you are more likely to see diabetes type 2. So this was another question that was very important to address. And I'm going to share with you data from a study where we were lucky enough to have the necessary information to be able to begin to address these two questions. So this is a wonderful European collaboration study that, as you can see, involved different countries. I'm sure by now, not only because of my name, but my accent, you worked out that I'm Italian by origin. And in fact, I was born and raised and did my medical school in Palermo, who was in Sicily, who was one of the center for this multi-site study. And in this study, we had two main aims. One was to identify within a specific time frame between 2011 and 2013 all the people that presented for the first time with a psychotic disorder to a very well-defined catchment area. So basically, we wanted to collect the information that allowed us to reliably measure across these places the number of new cases of psychotic disorder. And also, we would be having information on the characteristic of the general population of all these places to be able to calculate the incidence rates for psychotic disorder in each catchment area. At the same time, on a subset of the people that were recruited, both representing the general population and the one with a psychotic disorder, we did quite extensive interview, and we asked about things that we know have a role and risk factors. One of the data we asked about was history of cannabis use. And we also asked them to contribute with a sample of blood to be able to do later on genetic analysis. So the first set of data I was able to contribute to with my team was exactly to address a little bit the first question. Could it be that the pattern of use, so the frequency in this particular case of which people use and the type of cannabis they use, might they contribute to how likely they are to develop a psychotic disorder? So here there are three sort of graph which represent three city, the biggest city in this European collaboration. So you have on your left London, which is where I work, then in the middle Amsterdam, and then an area of inner city Paris. And what I want you to notice when you look at these three graphs is the similarity that in all of them, the green bar is the highest one. In London, it says 5.16, in Amsterdam, 9.43, and in Paris, 4.29. And what this number represents are the odds ratio of developing a psychotic disorder for this group represented by the green bar compared to this little lilac one that represent in all graph the reference group of people who never use cannabis. Now, these people in the green bar represent the one who had been using cannabis every day and with a THC concentration on average equal or greater to 10%. And I know that when we think about the type of cannabis you have available in the States, thinking of a cutoff of 10% as a high potency threshold is a bit pathetic because you have type of cannabis that are much more potent. But we wanted to be quite conservative and also to represent what was available at that time across Europe. You can see that across all the three graphs, when you consider this combination of frequency and potency, more frequently and more THC you have, greater is your odds ratio. But you can see that also this purple bar, which represents the people that use more than once a week, a concentration not very high in THC, they also have a high or an increase that is significant in the risk for psychotic disorder, which means that you can get lots of THC to your brain, either because you combine a high frequency and very potent types, but also if you use it every day and lots of it, you still get lots of THC to your brain. So it's not all about high potency cannabis, but it's really about the total amount that has to take into account frequency as well. So from this study, as I said to you, we're also aiming to be able to measure the incidence rates, which is a fancy way to say the number of new cases of psychotic disorder across the different sites. And so we were able to calculate the incidence rates. And this graph is telling you, if you forget for a moment about cannabis, that when we look across Europe at these sites and we take into account age, gender, and minority status, which we do know affect rates of psychotic disorder, we still find that there is at least a fourfold variation. Now, this is very important because this tells you that psychotic disorder don't present with the same incidence, so the same number of cases across different geographical places. And now we know that this is also the same over time. So there might be time in history where there's been more psychosis and time when there's been less psychosis. Now, why is that? I suggested that psychotic disorder are a multifactorial condition. So you can imagine that across different places and across time, the combination of risk factors might vary, and there might be times or places when there are more of the risk factors or less. So on the basis of this observation, well, I was very struck to see that my birth town had one of the lowest incidence rate for psychotic disorder in Europe. I always make a joke that I wasn't very smart from that point of view in moving from Palermo to London, especially because being female, I'm still at risk for psychotic disorder, given that in women there is a second peak of age of onset, around my age, in fact. This graph is telling you what I was alluding. So in this graph, what we are showing is the yellow line that you've been familiar now with, which is the up and down of the incidence rate of psychotic disorder. So again, in simple words, the number of new cases in different sites. And now there is another line, which is the green one. And what the green one is telling you is really the proportion of people in the general population of these sites that is using cannabis with a high potency variety. And you can see that the two lines are going up and down pretty much together. I was going to say very nicely together. Actually, it's not a very nice thing that this is telling us, because this is telling us that when there is lots of high potency cannabis consumption, there is lots of cases of psychotic disorder. You will see that at the top it says prevalence of high potency cannabis used in the population controls, because the controls of this study represented the general population, the population that we would call population at risk. They're not just friends and family of the academics. So they represent a good proxy for the general population of all the different sites catchment area. What, of course, happens when you publish something for this, and Beatriz suggested this when she introduced the debate that has been going on for over a decade and continues about stigmatizing cannabis use. Even in academia, when you publish a data like this, you get lots of colleagues who are not very convinced about the link between cannabis and psychosis, criticizing and saying, well, we're not sure what you're saying is right, because there could be alternative explanation to your data. And so one of the first criticism, which was actually very helpful, was introducing the role of genetics in all of this. And the comment that was made was, well, what if these people who are using high potency cannabis are actually people who have a high genetic load for schizophrenia in the first place? And this is what drives the choice for high potent type of cannabis. And then when they develop a psychotic disorder, this is really to do with a high genetic load of schizophrenia in the first place, not with the high potency that they are using. So we look at that. As I mentioned before, in this data set, we had data on from DNA. We could calculate what we know is a summary statistics that tell us how many risk gene for schizophrenia an individual carries, which is called polygenic risk score for schizophrenia. And we could actually run an analysis that explore if it was true that those with a high genetic risk for schizophrenia, whether they are more likely to use high potency cannabis, and the answer was no. The other thing that we wanted to do, and this was more of an issue of power, in the old sample, so we didn't divide it in the individual city this time, but we had the all European sample together. We wanted to see if when we look at the odds ratio in the people who use cannabis daily of high potency and the one that use also daily low potency and weekly use of high potency, and we run again the regression and we adjusted this time for genetic load for schizophrenia, if the association with an increase of psychotic disorder disappeared or became no longer significant. And as you can see from this graph, no, because even when you take into account genetic load for schizophrenia, the one, for instance, who have used daily high potency cannabis still have a 5-fold increase in risk for psychotic disorder. And these odds ratio are not just adjusted for the genetic load of schizophrenia, they are adjusted for any other drug that we know is associated with psychotic disorder, with age, gender, and also level of education, employment status, and other social demographic that we know can be associated with psychotic disorder. But what we also wanted to do, is what has been done in medicine in other multifactorial conditions, was to see what happens if you have both. And so what this graph is showing you, again, on the x-axis, on the horizontal line, is showing you from your left to the right a progressive increase in the genetic load for schizophrenia. So the amount of genes, little genes for schizophrenia that individual people carry. And on the y-axis, you have the probability of developing a psychotic disorder. What each of these colored lines represent is, again, the combination of frequency and potency that now you're becoming familiar with. And what I would like to draw your attention to is that, obviously, for all of these lines, so for all of this group of users, including the non-user, they are there somewhere, greater is the genetic load for schizophrenia, greater is the probability of developing a psychotic disorder. But there is a group, which is the pink one at the top, who represents, again, the daily users of high potency cannabis, who starts quite high, even with a low genetic load for schizophrenia, and remains the highest all the way. So what is this telling us? This is telling us that when you use cannabis to a very high level of exposure, so high frequency and high potency, you don't need the genetic for schizophrenia to develop a psychotic disorder. the load of exposure to cannabis is enough to tip you over the threshold and get you to develop the clinical disorder. But also it tells you that, of course, if you are using high potency cannabis daily and also you have lots of gene for schizophrenia, your probability really shoots high to a very worried combination. And again, this is to say, if you have a high genetic load for diabetes type 2, and you also increase progressively your weight to develop obesity, your probability of developing diabetes type 2 is greater than somebody who only has obesity or only has a genetic load for the condition. So again, what we expect in a multifactorial model of disease. But what do we know from other genetic studies? What has been very interesting in the last, particularly 6 to 7 years, is that the advancement in psychiatric genetics, but also in the analysis of genetic data, has allowed us to collect very large sample sizes, both from people who have a psychotic disorder and also from people with cannabis use disorder. So they use cannabis very heavily. And what these sets of genetic study have allowed us to see is that these two conditions actually overlap genetically, which suggests that perhaps there is some genetic underlying commonality, but we haven't really disentangled what this means. And there have been suggestions that people with high genetic load for cannabis use disorder, there might be a higher risk of developing schizophrenia, and this might be mediated by actually using cannabis, but also the other way around, that people with a high genetic load for schizophrenia are actually more likely to use cannabis. And the verdict is still out, and probably it's much more complicated than just having one or the other of the two explanations I've just given you. And this is because we now know that you can have a set of genes that have a direct independent effect on two different conditions that might you find co-occurring in individual. So this overlap genetically has not yet been entirely disentangled. And Mendelian randomization, which are studies that try to use genetic data to explain causality, have actually been to date slightly contradictory. So some of these data that have tried to establish causality from cannabis use disorder to schizophrenia or vice versa, some of them have shown that the direction of causality is in both directions. So from cannabis use to schizophrenia and from schizophrenia to cannabis use. Some have only shown from schizophrenia to cannabis use, and some only from cannabis use to schizophrenia. And this is probably also an issue of the methodology, which initially had to rely on very large schizophrenia samples, so much more powered, and slightly lower powered cannabis use disorder. But this is becoming more balanced recently. But I felt that to summarize this dispute of the genetic side of the debate, I will bring to your attention a very interesting commentary by Gillespie and Kendler, who reconcile what we've been talking about by saying, well, there are really three possibilities that we can consider. One, that cannabis use is entirely causal to psychotic disorder. Two, that cannabis use is partially causal and partially confounded by genetic or familial effect or reverse causation. Or three, that cannabis use is entirely non-causal. And they say, well, perhaps what we should do is to look at countries where there's been a change in the legal status of cannabis and see if in this country there's been a change in the incidence rate for psychotic disorder, meaning more cases of psychotic disorder. The reason why I highlighted the option two, because I think that, as always in biology, explanations are more complicated, and often when we look at individual people, that probably is a combination of all. For some people, there is a very important combination of genetic factor. For others, is more environmental, and for others, is a coexistence of the two. So I'm going to share with you what actually, in response to Gillespie and Kendler, what the epidemiology from countries where the legal status of cannabis can tell us. So one of the very first study came out of Portugal, and that's because Portugal, as early as 2001, changed the legal status of cannabis, decriminalizing it. So people will not be longer arrested if smoking or carrying cannabis, but they would be they would be referred to a service where they could receive support, psychological intervention to look at the effect that cannabis was having on their health. And this study, in some ways, very nice because it's very simple. It's very clean methodology. It's not a sophisticated statistic. What they look was at the number of hospitalization due to psychotic disorder associated to cannabis use between 2000 and 2015. And if you can read the numbers, you can see that in 2000, there were 20 cases of psychotic disorder with cannabis use, and in 2015, there were 588. I mean, this is a disconcerting 27% increase in this number of admission associated with cannabis use disorder. And this is interesting because in 2001, as I mentioned, is where decriminalization was introduced. I was actually very skeptical about this. I thought it was too striking to be true. But actually, these data have been later confirmed by other studies in other countries. And for instance, this is a study from Denmark, and those of you familiar with research coming from Denmark, especially in epidemiology, will know that they are very lucky. They have this extraordinary population registry where your data are uploaded when you're born and throughout all your life. That can be linked with your school records and your general practitioner and general sort of health records and so on. And so what they were able to do using the data from the registry was, first of all, to plot how the incidence rate of schizophrenia had actually changed over time between the early 70s and 2016. And you can see there is a big variation and a big shoot up in the 90s that then sort of remains high and then has got another shoot up in the early 2000s, which proves the point we were discussing earlier on, that as you have differences in the incidence of psychotic disorder by places, you can also have it over time in the same country, because things will change at different level and would affect many of the risk factors that contribute to the disorder. So is this have anything to do with cannabis in Denmark? Well, what we know that during the same period, particularly from the mid-90s to the 2015, there've been an increase in the general population in the consumption of cannabis and also an increased availability of high potency strains. And so what they did was to calculate something that is called the population attributable risk fraction. It sounds fancy, but it's nothing else than say, okay, if we find any changes over time in the number of people presenting with a disorder, in this case of schizophrenia, can we estimate which proportion of these new cases is attributed to a specific risk factor? And what they were able to show is that indeed the proportion of new cases of psychotic disorder over this period of time attributable to cannabis use had also gone up, explaining why, in part, these rates of psychosis had gone up. And this was adjusted for many other risk factors who might have changed over the same time frame. There have been now also many other studies, just that we won't have time to go through them, some from the States and actually one more recently from Canada on the same line of conclusion. But one of the things we've talked a lot about prevention, and I think it's very important to also give a positive message. This is actually a study that we have in press that I wanted to share with you because it gives a very important primary prevention message. One of the questions that often people ask me, well, I started using cannabis in my early teens. I've considered to stop, but will this reduce my risk of developing psychosis later on? And often people ask me this question because they know from the literature on tobacco and lung cancer that when we look at people who have stopped smoking tobacco, longer they have abstained, lower it becomes over time their risk to develop lung cancer. And so we wanted to do something very similar using the data from the same pan-European collaboration to see if people did stop using cannabis, what happened to the risk for psychotic disorder. So what this graph is telling you on the y-axis is the probability of developing a psychotic disorder, and on the x-axis, which is the horizontal, I'm sorry that you can't see that properly, weeks since a session, so weeks since people have stopped using cannabis. And then you have the usual lines. Now you're familiar. You know, I like lines because I'm very keen on this sort of combination of potency and frequency. And so what you can see that for all the lines, longer people have been off cannabis, lower becomes their risk of developing a psychotic disorder. But what I think is very interesting is that when you look at the usual pink line at the top, that pink line represents people who have been using daily high potency cannabis. And this is what is showing for them is that when you've been using daily high potency cannabis, even if you stop, compared to other people, you will take longer and perhaps your risk will never completely reversed, which is an important public education message. One, I think the good news is that if you do stop using cannabis, your risk that you might have accumulated previously might reduces, and that if you change, if your pattern of use has not been daily and high potency, your ability to reverse the risk you have potentially acquired is actually very significant. Sorry, I've just said what is written in this box. And now what I want to show you, and I feel very, very sort of strong about this. We've talked about prevention and we talked about stigma. With my students who come from a different and diverse background, socioeconomic, cultural, and ethic background, we put together a video which we feel summarizes in a lay language some of the evidence I've shared with you and the general understanding on where we are in relation of the association between cannabis and psychosis, hoping that if young people or in general people that want to understand about cannabis and psychosis listen to this video, they don't feel that this is sort of picking on particular population or stigmatizing anyone, but just sharing data for people to be able to make an informed choice and keep safe.
Whether for medical purposes, ceremonial, or recreational, human beings have been using cannabis for a very long time. More recently, global discussions and reforms on cannabis policy have sparked an effort to better understand the relationship between cannabis use, mental health, and any potential factors that might contribute to the positive or negative experiences one may face when using cannabis. While the common thought is that smoking a joint makes you happy, hungry, sleepy, there's also a number of people who report experiencing mental health issues, most notably psychosis. But what factors might cause these differences in experience? Well, we all have our own story. The places we've been and the experiences we've shared with the people around us all contribute to shaping how we act and react in the world. These range from our positive experiences to the traumas we might face throughout life. So it's plausible to suggest that genetic differences can shape our response to cannabis within different environments or conditions. Now, let's talk about baking to understand more. Imagine we're in a baking class and we've been asked to bake a cake. We'd first need to know the correct ingredients and specific conditions required to produce our cake. We can compare genetics to the cake mixture we prepare before baking. Just as different measures of flour, eggs, milk, and sugar will result in different textures and flavors in the cake, different genetics may influence our response to cannabis. We can think of our social background as a cake too. Whilst the baking temperature and baking time reflect the context in which we use cannabis here and now. Our choice of cake tin will determine the size and shape of the cake. There are many tins to choose from. It's where the mixture is poured to set and build structure. Our mental health is highly influenced by socioeconomic, political, and cultural environments throughout our lifespan. Even if everyone in the baking class uses the same recipe and ingredients, even the slightest difference in baking conditions will result in different outcomes. Similarly, even if two individuals share the same genetics, a variety of environmental and lifestyle conditions can shape their response and increase the chances of experiencing psychosis more likely than the other. And last but not least, the icing on the cake, cannabis. There are many ways to ice a cake, and just as many to make one too sweet and sickly. In the same way, there are many strains of cannabis that come in different strengths and should be used in different quantities. Frequent use of potent strains of cannabis, or over-icing the cake, might cause users to experience symptoms of psychosis, especially if the other ingredients and conditions are also contributing to that outcome. Trying to understand these complex interactions can guarantee that the cake comes out just right and that cannabis users stay safe, and that poor mental health through cannabis use is prevented. Thanks for watching.
Well, thanks for watching as well in this case. So following from the data I've shared with you on how cannabis contributes to the onset of psychotic disorder, I would like to move to a different type of prevention, which is tertiary prevention, which is the one that is dear to me because it's the one I try to practice in my work as a clinician. So one thing we do know, and actually there's not been much controversy or not as much as for what I shared with you so far, is what happens if you have developed a psychotic disorder and you continue to use cannabis, or if in the era of medicinal cannabis, you get told that cannabis would be good for your psychosis because it will relax you and makes you feel less anxious. Now, well, we now know very clearly, and there have been lots of studies from many, many countries. I'm just sharing one of them with you, that if you continue to use cannabis following the onset of a psychotic disorder, or you even start using cannabis following the onset of a psychotic disorder, this is going to have a very profound negative impact on your clinical and functional outcome, how well you have a chance to do. And this is very important because we've gone on for many, many decades with this completely wrong assumption that if you develop a psychotic disorder, you were doomed to a bad outcome and you were never going to recover or recover just very little. Now we know that the people who have a very negative, disabling, chronic course of psychotic disorder is really a small proportion, around 13%. Majority of other people, some of them fully recover, some of them might have a reoccurrence of episode, but they can actually go back to a reasonable level of functioning, as you can do for other conditions across psychiatry and also medicine. And what we do know, and again, this is prevention, that the people who continue to use cannabis, and again, this is the green line that you can see at the top of the survival care, are the ones that are more likely to relapse, so to become unwell over and over again, and much faster than any other groups. And we do know that these people are more likely to be readmitted to hospital, to stay in hospital longer, to have more severe symptoms that requires them to be admitted under the care of psychiatric services against their will, which is an awful experience. And they're less likely to regain a good level of functioning, going back to education or to work. And this is very important because as by informing people of the risk of cannabis in relation to psychosis, you can prevent the onset of psychosis. You can also give chance to young people who have developed psychosis to change the course of the illness. And there was a point where we believed that the reason why cannabis was having a negative impact on the course of psychosis was because there'd been a suggestion that people who use cannabis and have psychosis are less likely to take the medication prescribed by doctors. But actually now we know that when you compare on the left, the people who are taking religiously their psychiatric medication with on the right, the people who are actually more likely to stop, in both of these group, the one in blue are the cannabis users are much more likely to relapse. So unfortunately, even if you take your antipsychosis religiously, you will still relapse more likely and faster than those who are not using cannabis. And so where are we, or where am I? So I am in a place, London, where our mayor is, after visiting California, has been so impressed by the cannabis plant that has decided to pilot a scheme for legalizing cannabis roughly in the area where I work. And we know that Elon Musk is thinking to plant cannabis in space because he's very concerned that we're running out of plantation on Earth. So in my trust, the proportion of people under the care of us with cannabis use and psychotic disorder is extraordinarily high. You know, of all the psychotic patients under the care of our huge catchment area hospital is 60%. And when you look at them under the care of intensive care psychiatric unit, it goes up to 80%. And when you look at the one under the care of the forensic services, so people that also have a forensic history, is up to 96%. So not something you can ignore as a clinician if you work where I do. So to follow from Walt Disney, who is one of my heroes, rather than thinking and complaining about this, we decided to give reality to one of our dreams, which was the one, excuse me, to set up a bespoke service for young adults who have a psychotic disorder and they're using cannabis and they're struggling to make changes to the cannabis use, and support them with making these changes. And we develop, and this cartoon represents the journey that my patient wished to do, which is the one from a brain filled predominantly with cannabis and not much else, to a brain that again has got space for relationship, for hobbies, for sports, for music, and for going back to studying. We did this thanks to charity funding. The NHS usually doesn't have much resources, so they're not very keen on starting something new unless you can prove that this might change really the care you can provide. So we started with charity money, and we were very lucky to have them. And what we were able to do was to bring together all colleagues, friends who were experts in both addiction and psychosis. We didn't want to invent something new. We wanted to use something that has worked well in psychosis and worked well in addiction, bring it together and make it workable and adjustable and tailored to the needs of this population of young adults. And we also created a peer group. So this was an initiative where online, and you're very welcome to join us if you like. Every Tuesday, 4 to 5 on Zoom, we have experts from all around the world. Professor De Souza has been one of our wonderful speakers. And we have young adults with psychosis who are in the community or who are on the inpatient unit in our trust, who come along and present data like we're doing today on cannabis, its effect on mental health, and particularly on psychosis. And then the conversation sparks. And this is the leaflet that the patients receive. And they just have to click and come on live. And the interaction that you see among them is pretty spectacular. And as a clinician, I learn more from them than probably they've learned from me. So what do we do? As I said, we use things that are well established in addiction, and I'll be quite quick on this because, as I said, we haven't invented anything new. They receive one-to-one individual session for a minimum of 20 times over several weeks. And we measure it before they start and at the end, a variety of dimensions. They're not just about cannabis consumption, but mood, anxiety, how much they spend on cannabis, and you'll see which these measures are. And these are not just for my benefit to be able to show that things do change and improve over time, but also for the individual to see how they progress. This is some of the team that you can see is very diverse in terms of age, gender, ethnicity, and species, as my dog is often part of some of the activities we do. And I'm just going to start with going towards my conclusion to say this is the population we care for. So predominantly male, a sort of a mixed background, mostly on their own with no social relationship, and very low level of engagement in activities, neither work or studying or other. And not too bad in terms of pre-morbid level of education, but very few have reached higher education. So here I'm going to go to what is the core of the point. So here you see in red what the 46 people who have completed the intervention, and we have a paper in press on this to date, where before they started the intervention trying to change their cannabis use, they were all above the threshold of cannabis use disorder. When they complete the intervention, 73% of them are completely stopped, and their minority use only once a week. And you can see how the cannabis use disorder score has significantly reduced. This has profoundly changed the experience of delusion. This is a measure of delusional persecution. Red is before reducing the cannabis use, green is after. Profound effect on paranoia. Blue is level of paranoia before, and the other box is after. This also has a remarkable change in anxiety. So saying to patients with psychosis that cannabis reduces anxiety is nonsense, because this was a secondary measure, and we actually show that also their anxiety reduces over time when they stop or significantly reduce the amount of consumption. Same for depression. This is a measure of depression. I mean, you might, when you are acutely intoxicated, feel high and chilled, but actually overall, it does have a negative impact on depression as well. And this improves when you reduce significantly or stop your cannabis. Huge change in level of functioning, which here, this is a graph slightly more complicated to say. You might say to me, okay, well, they stopped the cannabis use and all these things have changed. Could it be a coincidence? Well, this graph show you statistically that it is the change in cannabis use that drives the change in this measure of symptoms and level of functioning, which I've shown you. But I want to come to conclusion with this slide to say that if you forget about the first two blocks and you look at the one in pink and blue, this is telling you that the majority of them at baseline were doing nothing. And at the follow-up, the majority of them have gone back to work and study, which to me is very important because this is a group of young people which tells me that have improved so much in the psychopathology that they can go back to function and get good quality of life. So I'm going to conclude. Well, they save lots of money on not buying so much cannabis, which is quite intuitive. But I'm going to conclude by showing a video to you of one of them. So actually, these are some quotes of one of them that completed the intervention last week. And to say that I learned from them more than they learned from me. So we asked them why it was helpful to attend the clinic. And he said, well, getting me out of the house initially really helped, gain more confidence. I have less anxiety and definitely have more motivation. Then we asked him, what do you feel helped you to reduce and eventually stopped? He say, well, as I cut down, my confidence grew, getting the emotional support I needed when I was struggling. Very important. When I was working, he didn't feel that we were actually, contrary to the general addiction services, they felt that we were not pressuring. We didn't give them a time frame. We didn't say you have to stop within this number of session. We gave him a chance to work out his timeline. And this clearly was very useful to him. And he also felt that he was not judged. He was not told what to do or that what he was doing was bad or good. It was for him to decide. And here is my final part, which is a short video of one of them who's also given a feedback of the work.
So hi Marta, thank you for coming today. So you've been working with myself at the Cannabis Clinic for some time now. And I know that when you referred to us, that cannabis had brought on your psychosis. So you're well aware of the impact that it's had on your mental well-being. Since working with the clinic, what do you think has been beneficial to you?
Okay, well, there's been a lot of things that have been beneficial to me. And the first thing is for me is being listened to. From the time I started working with you, I've always felt like I talk about my issues to do with my drug addiction, and I feel like I'm not being judged, which is nice. I can share my mind, share my feelings, share my thoughts, and I just.
So I'm going to stop here, and I'm going to actually progress with this to say that again, as a clinician, I've learned that as much as my advice of saying, oh, you should stop, you should reduce is helpful, it can come across as a judgment, it can come across as patronizing, and it's really helping people to give them a space and time where talk about their relationship with cannabis, where it comes from, how long it's been there. They can give them a chance to make changes. And we have created an online portal, which is a resource where we bring together lots of what we do. And it's something that, including lots of video, people will lived experience, which gives a chance to the people under our care to go back and reflect and think in their own time, any time of the day, even out of hours when none of us is available. And we are thinking about what we do go next, how we can improve the care we provide, how we can improve the choice of medication we prescribe, and we get them more on board overall with the treatment. And I would like to say that none of what I've shared with you, from the research to the translational work to the clinic, could happen without the amazing team I have the pleasure to work with, my junior colleagues, my clinical colleagues, and my pets that, as you have understood by now, are an important part of my life because they keep me sane within my busy lifestyle and time frame of my work. Thank you very much for your attention, and I'm looking forward to your questions.
Wonderful. Thank you very much. Again, my name is Kristen Haley, and I'm with the Liquor and Cannabis Board. I'm going to float you a softball question while people continue to enter questions. What's your cat's name?
My cat's name is Rob Roy, and the reason is that he's a Scottish fold, and my husband, who's also Scottish, only allow us to have pets in the house who have Scottish names. So Rob Roy is a famous Scottish character. And if we had more time, I will tell you a story. There's also a very catchy song. But if you put online Rob Roy McGregor Scotland, you will learn about him.
Wonderful. I'm no regrets about asking that question. Okay, there was another softball question that I will answer on your behalf. All of the slides and the recordings will be available online in about a week on ADAI's website. The next question I thought was really interesting because it can ground us kind of in what you were talking about towards the end. What do you think people with psychosis and schizophrenia gain from using cannabis? And thinking about that, I think the question also went into what sorts of things do you think can replace cannabis in their treatment and recovery?
So that's a very important question, because this is what I tend to talk. I mean, I'm coming from my clinic here in London this evening, and I actually had a very long conversation with one of my young patients about what does cannabis do for him. And so I guess there are two components. One is the high. So if you are experiencing hallucination, if you feel the world is hostile towards you, if you have been in hospital or in and out several times and you have disengaged from friends, cannabis, it's something that one links you back to times when you were socializing. It might still allows you to be with friends, tolerating being in a social context, but also it gives you that high which detaches you from reality. And so while you are intoxicated, you sort of feel less bothered and less distressed by the belief that you have, your delusion. So you might think that your neighbor are against you, but temporarily this doesn't distress you as much as when you're not at the high of the intoxication. And patients would also say to me that sometimes when they are at the high of the intoxication, the voices they hear are not as intrusive and as distressing. The problem is then that they get into a vicious circle, because when they come off the high of the intoxication, all these symptoms flare up with much more intensity. And so they go back to use, and they sometimes find themselves increasing and increasing what they need to feel their high that gives them a brief relief from the psychosis. For the one that are less severely unwell, cannabis, depending where they live and when they are, is still a link to the social context. It's still something that they feel they have in common with their friends. And this is the example of the young man I spoke to today. His girlfriend is still using cannabis, and he says, well, when my girlfriend comes by, she is fine. She doesn't feel the same way I do on cannabis. It would be very difficult for me not to use together with her. So there's also the social, the peer influence or pressure or component, if you like. And we know this is the same across all substances. What is a good substitute? Well, this is very individual. I think generally speaking, it's very sensible when people are going from regular use, whatever you decide might be a substitute, to introduce it very gradually and very gently. And people are very good at identify what might be something that gives them a reward, which it might be not exactly the same as cannabis, but equally attractive. And so I've seen young people gently substituting cannabis with a bit of exercise, gently substituting cannabis with a bit more music, gently substituting cannabis with perhaps getting involved in activities which can be provided even through the mental health services. For instance, we have a breakfast club that we run in the morning now once a month. So even coming out to the breakfast club and no using at all that morning, it's a way to prove yourself that you can do a morning without cannabis, and that might become a motivator to introduce other activities. But this is a very personal process. I will not be able to say to you, oh, exercise works for everybody. There are some people that hate exercise in the general population, forget about cannabis users, and you can't force into them. Some people would do very well with video games. I'm useless at video games. So it's something that you work out with the individual, and this is why having this bespoke space for them, it can be very helpful. In terms of medication, we don't yet have a consensus on, is there a type of medication that can reduce craving and improve people's chances to stop or reduce their cannabis, except what we do know is that giving antipsychotic, which are heavy D2 blockers, so they are heavy, antagonize heavily the dopamine system, can actually precipitate craving and make any reduction in cannabis worse, and often induces people to increase their cannabis use. So perhaps going for partial agonist, so antipsychotic that still allows some of the endogenous dopamine to do her work and make people feel brain live, can actually help with engaging them in reducing their cannabis use. I don't know if you wanted to know all of this about medication, but happy to answer more questions.
Well, judging by some of the questions, oh, now it's blank, so I'm going to go off of memory of what I saw on the question list. A number of people did ask for specific clinical recommendations, so I think you did scratch that itch for the folks in the audience that had those questions. I'm going to take us further upstream now. A number of questions were asking about prevention and harm reduction. What sorts of policy systems and environmental strategies would you recommend for this issue and keeping people safe and healthy?
Well, I think I know in US, and of course US is huge, so it's been different approaches in different states. And I think you have done much better than us because, for instance, in UK, we have no public education strategy to prevent harmful effects of cannabis use. There's no education on cannabis that happens on media or on social media or mainstream or anywhere. So anything that I think shares information with the young people about cannabis in a non-judgmental way. And I don't know, actually, I will ask you, do you think something like the little video that I have shared could be helpful? Do you think young people would listen to it, would engage with it? Would I find it patronizing? I think using something similar with a similar language on social media, getting influencer and pop star and people that the youth look up at to talk about it. I think we always say with Professor Sir Robin Murray that us talking to young people about what cannabis does or not does to you often doesn't have much of an effect, but having a young pop star who says or come out publicly say, I had bad effect on cannabis, and to be able to do what you all enjoy, such as my music, I had to make a decision to stop, can be much more powerful and can be the beginning of a conversation to which then you add data and science. And I think we should do more of that, like it has been done for alcohol and tobacco and other substances, or as it has been done in other sort of area of medicine when there've been lots of education on healthy eating and more generally lifestyle. So I think we could do much more than that and engage young people who have a voice among young people to help us with that.
I think that is a fantastic note to end on. Thank you so much, Dr. DeForti, for being here. One more round of applause, please.